Welcome to the best of first-person episodes from Phantoms and Monsters. Please like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you'll be notified of all future uploads.
The Dark Walker. When I was a boy, my mother and I lived with my grandfather who had a farmhouse in a rural location in southwestern Pennsylvania. My grandfather was a handyman who also worked a small blacksmith shop in his old barn. My grandmother had died before I was born, and my father had also passed away while serving overseas in the U.S. Army. Beginning in the summer of 1946, we noticed strange howling sounds coming from the woods that surrounded the property. The activity came at night and was very frightening when the howling came close. The sounds didn't seem to bother my grandfather, though my mother and I were shaken when it would begin. The sounds continued off and on for about a year, but we never noticed any animals. My grandfather and I would hunt for deer and squirrel in the woods during the colder months, but we never saw signs of unusual animal activity. One late afternoon in the spring of 1947, I was helping my grandfather in his shop when I noticed something moving around the edge of the woods near an area where my grandfather had a few junk cars and other items. It was about 200 feet from our location, but I clearly noticed someone or something moving around. I told my grandfather to look. He walked to the door, lit his pipe and said nothing. After a minute or two he turned around and got back to work. About that time this thing moved into the woods and disappeared. I couldn't judge how big it was, but it sort of reminded me of a magazine picture I had seen of a large ape that was said to inhabit in the Asian jungles. Later that evening I told my mother what I had seen. She was shocked because she knew I wouldn't lie to her and that the howling sounds had been closer lately. I also told her of my grandfather's response when I pointed the creature out to him. She immediately stood up and walked into the sitting room in order to ask my grandfather what it was. He started to shake his head slowly and said that he was hoping that we wouldn't see it because he was worried we would be scared and leave him. After assuring him that we'd never leave him, my mother again insisted that he tell us what this creature was. He looked away, took a deep breath and said it's a dark walker and said that it had lived in the woods for many years. He said the native Indians called it stone spirit and they thought that it was an evil spirit who would appear when someone was about to die. The last time he had seen the dark walker was the night before my grandmother died. My mother was skeptical of the harbinger of death angle, but she sensed that there was something unnatural nearby. The howling continued each night, though we hadn't seen any signs of the dark walker. One warm evening we were sitting on the back porch. There were a few howls, but it seemed like the sounds were further away. We were listening to the radio when all at once my grandfather stood up and looked out towards the barn. He turned to me and said, "John, go get my pistol and ammo, hurry now." I ran into the sitting room and grabbed the .455 Webley revolver and a handful of bullets from the old steamer trunk. I handed it to him and watched him load the gun. He then picked up a hatchet and slid it in his pants belt. "Now both of you get into the house, now." We were in the kitchen looking through the screen door and watched my grandfather walk slowly towards the barn. We saw him turn and walk out of sight into the dark. I decided to grab my shotgun and keep it nearby. After a minute or so we heard 3 gunshots and a blood-curdling scream emanate from the woods near the barn. Then it suddenly stopped and there was complete quiet. We were frozen and wondering if we should go look for my grandfather. A few seconds later we heard him yell, "Stay in the house until I come back." I heard the pickup truck start up. I looked out the storage room window and saw my grandfather drive to the back of the barn and park. Several minutes later he backed up and drove by the side of the house out onto the road. I could see that there was something in the back covered up with a tarp. It was getting late so my mother told me to go to bed. The next morning I came downstairs and sat beside my grandfather who was reading the newspaper and drinking a cup of coffee. My mother was sitting at the other end of the table staring at my grandfather. Not long later she said, "Well Dad, tell him." My grandfather put the paper down and looked at me. "I killed the dark walker." That was all he said. My mother told me not to tell anyone and that the matter was closed. We never talked about it again. My grandfather lived another 15 years and my mother stayed with him until his dying day. When I grew older I moved away and raised a family. I would return home to visit each summer and never heard another howl. John.
Did the Loveland Frogman return? We bought a little house down by the Loveland Castle Museum back in 2000. It was perched above a ravine and creek, and the back of the house dropped off very steeply. There would have been enough room for a man or a bipedal person to stand behind the house, but the basement windows were eye level, and the first floor was quite far up from the place where one could stand. The reason I point this out is that because it was a very small house, we had to use the basement for our two boys' bedroom. They kept complaining that something kept looking in the window at them, and my husband and I laughed it off at first. It was a wooded setting, very rural and beautiful, and very dark at night, having no streetlights out there. So it seemed funny that they were thinking something was watching them. We just told them maybe it was a deer, they are plentiful in the fall, and went about our business. One night, however, I woke hearing a weird sound just outside our bedroom window on the first floor. It faced out back of the house, and I was puzzled as to what it could be because it sounded like a man, breathing heavily. I started to sit up and realized that whatever it was looking in my window, just inches from my head, and I was terrified. I did not look out because I knew that I would see it, and I kept feeling something urging me to look. We often would hear squeaking noises, screeching, not like an owl, and a crying baby. I woke my husband up, and he said whatever it was, it would have had to be 10 feet tall to look in our window. I couldn't sleep that night, but whatever had been there had moved on. I didn't mention it to the kids the next day. The boys came up from the basement, shaken from seeing the red, glowing eyes the night before. They were every bit as big as red road reflectors, and they heard heavy breathing, and the hair on their bodies stood up on end. This was only one experience we had out there in Loveland. It's right down by the Little Miami River, only a stone's throw. Many weird things out there, green glows, orbs, something very large and black on top of the roof of the house very late at night. When light was shone on it, it did not go through whatever it was on the roof, and it looked like a huge dark figure. I'd like to know if you have any more weird stories about this area. We moved a few miles away but still go past that area often. CF.
Foul-smelling deerman encountered in northeast Arkansas. This happened to me in January 2014 on a back road in northeast Arkansas. At the time I was a newspaper delivery driver. I picked up my papers from the press usually at 12:15 a.m., and it was a 45-minute drive to get to the start of my route. At the time I was a cigarette smoker, so after I bagged up enough newspapers to sustain my route for a while, I'd light up a cigarette and roll the window down. Being cold, I tried to keep it up as much as possible because my car back then didn't have AC. There's a really long stretch of gravel road called Old Military Road near Harrisburg, Arkansas. On the left side of the road are mostly houses, and on the right is fence posts and open pasture with barns and troughs for horses and cows. It is in the middle of nowhere though. There are no streetlights, some people have floodlights in their yard. So I'm driving along with my windows down smoking a cigarette. It's about 2:30 a.m. and begin smelling a combination of burning hair and urine. Like, not a mixture of the two, but one and also the other. It isn't a great smell. I toss the cigarette and roll my window up, but can still smell whatever this awful smell is. The further I go down the road the worse the smell gets. Usually see some of the cows sleeping outside or horses chilling sometimes, but nothing tonight. So I know that I'm not the only one that picked up on something being weird that night. As I'm coming up to a fork in the road, I have to take the left. There is a big open field to the far right. I see what looks like a man with a deer's head. It was too dark for me to tell whether it was a man wearing a deer skull or an actual human deer cross, but it was definitely the source of the whatever the smell was. It scared the FCK out of me, and I didn't want to hang out long enough to figure out exactly what it was. To my perception, he was at shoulder height, 7 feet tall. The head probably added a foot of height, I don't know, but he was massive. There were definitely deer antlers. And the smell was disgusting. I saw him stretch his arms. Imagine flexing your arms and chest by making a wide C with your arms. His movement, for the 2 to 3 seconds I saw him, looked to be human. I found a new job by late January and started by February. Was not interested in ever being out in that area again. Creepy deer man, let's not meet. PK.
This is Lon Strickler. If you like this program, it would help us if you would give it a thumbs up. Then subscribe and click the bell icon so you get notification when we upload new first-person encounters. We have many more to come very soon. And by the way, if you have a suggestion or an experience of your own, please leave a comment.